Hello, this is Taylor Elwood with Indie Author Business Success, and I'm really pleased today because I have with me Mark Reid, maybe Mark Reid. You'll correct me in a moment here, Mark, but from Author Packages, who is actually the creative services that I use for my cover art. I've been working with them since 2018, and he's here with me today, and we're going to be talking about why it's so important to use a creative service when you're an indie author, because a lot of indie authors have a tendency to try and do it all themselves. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where we can find you on the web and everything else?
Hey, my name's Mark. I've been a graphic designer for just about 30 years now. I'm based in Scotland, and the website is authorpackages.com. There's editing, proofreading, formatting, cover design, all sorts of stuff.
Excellent. And for folks who are looking in the show notes for this, there is a link that is actually an affiliate link, my affiliate link to said website. So go ahead and if you click on that, I do get a little bit of money, but it's their services are awesome. So I started my indie author journey actually in 2018, and it was kind of funny because when you and I first got on, you're like, "Really? It's only been that long? I thought it was longer." Yeah, it was really only that long ago. Although I've given you like a ton of book covers over the years, so I mean, I could see why
hmm
you think it was longer than that. But one of the things that really first struck me when I was researching about the whole indie author thing is like there's a lot of moving parts. There's editing, there's layout and design, and there's cover art, and there's all this other stuff. And like how as an indie author do you handle all that? And I realized, it's not realistic. I mean, sure, and like I could rely upon, for example, my wife to do the editing for me, but she's not a graphic design person. I'm not a graphic design person, at least not like a really good one. And I don't want to spend all my time working on cover art. And I can do the layout of myself because I've been in the publishing industry for a long time, so I know how to do layout, but not everyone does. And so let's talk a little bit about why it's important to not try and do it all yourself. I mean, you're in this space, you work with authors all the time. Give me your side of it. Like, what's your perspective on that, and why authors sometimes try to do it all themselves when they really should be working with someone like you?
I'm not sure why they decide to do it themselves. I can tell you why I would do it myself is because I'm just one of these people that does everything. When I've got something in my mind, I decide I'm going to be the one that does all of it. Um, when I was in a band, we did all of that sort of stuff ourselves. But once I started to, when I got into graphic design, and I think it was 1992, it was one of these things where I was designing album covers and posters for my own band and other people who were playing on the same set as us. So like we'd either be supporting them or they would headline and that kind of thing. We'd see their posters, and I would think to myself, they would have so many more people if they just had a decent poster. So rather than us just always doing the artwork for ourselves, I then started to help all the other bands out by doing all their artwork for them. And the number of people that came along to the gigs, it blew up because they were being portrayed in a professional manner. Therefore, people were expecting a higher standard of performance, and it translates to everything else. Anytime when I first started in graphic design as a professional, we'd have people that would have like a shop 2 or 3 stores down from where we were based, and they'd have been doing everything themselves. They would do their newspaper adverts themselves. They would do their leaflets themselves. Even their stationery was designed by themselves, and their businesses were okay. They were getting people through the door. There was word of mouth. People would come back to them, but they didn't have a broad reach. So they would come to us and say, look, is there anything you can do with what we've already got? We'd then take their work, create a marketing campaign for them, design everything for them. And that's how it just worked. So there's no difference really from any business whatsoever to cover design or being an author. Authors need to understand, and many people don't, that they are a commodity. They themselves, their name, their brand is a commodity, and it has to be professional. People have to look at it, they have to think to themselves, this looks interesting, this looks professionally done, and I'm going to look into it more. If you've got a terrible cover, it doesn't matter how good the book is. I know that there is that old adage of you can't judge a book by the cover, and it is true to some extent, but there are some fantastic books out there that I guarantee nobody will read because the cover is bad. And if you are thinking about designing your own cover, if you know about graphic design, then you might be able to pull it off. But even the graphic designers that I know, there's a difference between graphic design and cover design. I had to learn cover design, even being somebody who'd been doing graphic design and marketing for, by that point, I think it was about 25, 26 years. It's not cover design. It's a very, very different thing. So if you want a cover designed, go to a cover designer. Don't go to a graphic designer, go to a cover designer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. It's interesting because I think that the reason, my own opinion on why authors try to do it all themselves, a lot of times boils down to money, because
Yeah.
you're starting out and you're not working with a publishing house, and when you work with a publishing house, and again, I used to be in traditional publishing, so I know all this. Like when you work with a traditional publisher, the traditional publisher takes care of the editing, takes care of the cover art, basically takes care of the layout, basically puts the bill for everything other than the writing itself, and then puts it out there. Now I'm not going to say that traditional publishers do a great job with marketing, because they don't, in my experience. In fact, a lot of times they leave a lot of the marketing to authors anyway, and that was one of the reasons why I went down the indie author path. I was like, all right, I'm writing these books, and and where I worked, I mean, I was actually both the writer and the publisher, so I had a lot more say than what a normal author would have with a traditional publisher. Like I basically was able to choose my cover art and what I liked for my books. I did the layout myself. But most authors don't even get that when you're working with a traditional publisher, and most authors don't want that. They don't want to do the cover art. They don't want, they don't want to handle the marketing and distribution. But reality is that when you're an author, whether you're traditional or otherwise, you're going to have to. And so I think a lot of times people focus in on the money aspect of it without realizing that the the other side of that equation, that a great cover sells more books. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like when you're designing a cover for an author, what is it that you're thinking of in order to help them create the right kind of cover that's going to make their book stand out?
I actually do something very different from what most cover designers do, because most cover designers will look at the genre and that's going to be about as far as it goes. So they'll look at who the top selling books are in a particular genre, in a particular category, and they'll think to themselves, this is what I need to set as my baseline. So if if it has a specific look to it, then that's the kind of look that's going to sell. Therefore, that's what I need to focus on, and that's what I need to give my client. I'm the opposite of that because I've seen all these mood boards. I've seen the people that have um, genre tropes for like urban fantasy or paranormal romance or all these things, where you look at probably 50 or 60 covers and you probably couldn't pick your own cover out of all those covers because they have the same elements, they have the same sort of look and feel to them. And for me, I mean, it works. Those people sell those books, but they're going to sell the books at a certain level and they're going to sell them to a certain kind of customer. And the people that come to me don't really want that. They want their books to be sitting on a shelf next to J.K. Rowling's or Dan Brown's or anything else, and for people to see that book and not think to themselves, that looks a bit out of place. That doesn't look like that should be there at all. They want the book to be seen on the shelf along with everybody else and nobody to give it a second thought because it just looks like it should be there. So the first thing I like to do is to get to know the client. I don't take the brief and then disappear for weeks and then come back with a couple of drafts and say, here's what I think you might like. What do you reckon? Because that's a waste of time. People think that what I do is a waste of time because I spend so much time at the start getting to know the client, getting to know what the book is. Or sometimes I'll even read the manuscript. Not all of it, but I'll read some of it. I've read some of your manuscripts before doing stuff.
Yeah, you have.
I think it's important. I think you have to understand the psychology behind what it is you're creating the cover for. Because if you don't know what you're actually creating the cover for, you could go in exactly the wrong direction just because the client has said to you, it's this genre, this is who I'm going to target. So then you create the cover art based on what they've told you. They put it out there and they'll initially get sales because nobody knows what the book is about. But if it's marketed to the wrong person, then they're going to get negative reviews. So you absolutely have to understand what the book is, who the author is, and what the whole sort of message is that's coming from the book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction or whatever genre it's in. It makes no difference. The message is still there in every single book. So for me, get to know the client, find out their personality, find out the personality of the book, take that into consideration when you've got the genre, and then design something that not only makes them individual, but will also work within the genre without somebody thinking that shouldn't be there. Because ultimately, it has to appear within the categories alongside all their peers, and it has to be taken seriously. Ultimately, that's the most important thing is the professionalism above all.
Well, I like your approach. In fact, I mean, I kind of, I would insist upon it myself because I mean, I know like in my case, I want to make sure that my cover artist, or for that matter, like someone doing the editing or anything, that they have a good sense of my psychology and where I'm coming from and what I'm looking
Mhm.
for. Because I mean, I think as an indie author, one of the most important things is like you realize like when you're choosing to invest in a creative service, it's like i'm paying I'm paying a lot of money for me, you know, because I mean, and I'm not going to necessarily see that money right away, you know, because I'm going to put the book out there, and it's going to take a little bit of time. I mean, I have the advantage in some cases over a lot of other indie authors in that I have at least in the case of my occult nonfic, I have a pre-existing audience. So like whenever I get a cover from you for that cover usually within the month is I've already paid that off in terms of the cost because that's, you know, I just get those sales. Fiction takes a bit longer because that's a new audience for me. And the indie author success thing, again, another new audience. So, you know, I think that it's really important to know, like when you're talking with somebody, that it's not just, oh yeah, I'm going to come back and give you a couple ideas. Instead, it's I've looked at your manuscript. I've gotten a sense of who you are and what you're looking for, and what your characters are like in the case of fiction, or what your nonfiction is like. I mean, I knew for me when when I shopped around for basically for you for my cover art, I really came at it from the approach of, okay, there's lots of cover artists out there, but what is it that I'm really looking for? And what I like about your website, I mean, you guys have a very friendly website. I really like it a lot. And I liked the sense of personality. And when I first contacted you, you got back to me fairly quickly and you started sharing some stories about yourself, which was really cool because I'm like, oh, hey, this person wants to get to know me and I want to get to know him. And I mean, I love our email exchanges every time, which is about once a month because I'm usually sending you a cover a month. Um, if not a little bit more on occasion. And which you know, I mean, you're the cover artist I work with. I mean, I haven't worked with anyone else as far as the covers go for my books since I started this whole thing because I'm really comfortable with your approach. I like the fact that you take the time to get to know me and that you've taken the time to look at some of my manuscripts and get a feel for what I'm trying to do and where I'm trying to go with my books. And as my wife says, she's always like, "Oh, I love those covers. I'm so glad that you know that you have." And it's true. I mean, my covers really stand out. They pop in a nice way, which is really good because I mean, the it's like you said earlier. You know, as much as we might like to believe in that old adage that it doesn't that the you know don't judge a book by its cover, the fact of the matter is people do judge books by their covers, especially I think now, like in an online world where you know you can't even necessarily pick up that book. You have
Yeah.
to have a cover that is going to grab people's attention because you're like on Amazon, you're basically in a sea of covers where
Mhm.
people can see all those covers at once as opposed to just seeing, you know, just picking a book up even.
Yeah, the thing about Amazon is that there are so many people now that can literally just, if they wanted to, they could write a book in a week, um, throw a cover together themselves, stick it on Amazon, and how do you compete with all these things? How do you get yourself noticed and among the thousands? I mean, I think somebody mentioned recently there's something like 6,000 new authors that come to Amazon. I can't remember if it was per day or per week, but that's an insane number of people. And you have to be seen among those people, but you also have to stand above the crowd. The thing I hate is when you look at somebody's cover and you can straight away see that they've they've seen a cover somewhere else, and whether they've done it subconsciously or whether they've actively decided that I like that cover a lot and I want to try and mimic that. It's quite heartbreaking at times because you know that the person that created the cover originally is going to see this and think, I put a week work into this, and somebody's just come along and jumped into Microsoft Paint or whatever and thrown together a clone of it in 10 minutes and hoping for the best. But yeah, I think the aspect to the personality is the thing that's lost most on the number of books that I see on a daily basis. Um, I mean, I'm probably in around 15 or 20 different cover gallery groups or cover designer groups, and there's some fantastic artists in there, and there's also the people that are just getting started. Um, but you can see from most of the new people anyway that they're leaning towards a particular artist's style. I suppose it's like with anything, like with tattoo artists or whatever. There's going to be somebody that started a trend, and therefore everybody else will then take up that trend and follow it, and hopefully improve upon it. But these days, I think the thing that most cover designers are up against is that there's so many people who just create the same sort of style, which is it's a real shame. Um, yeah, the one thing that you mentioned was the number of times that we email. I think probably 10 or 20% of the people that I deal with, I only hear from when they've got something that they want. And the rest of the people, I'll just get emails anyway asking how things are going because we do have that relationship where we're just friends. There are some corporate clients, but the majority of people are just self-published authors that they want to get their own voice out there, and um, they they like to actually have to somebody to speak to rather than just fill out a form and hope for the best. But I love every time you get in contact. I think to myself, "Oh God, what are we doing now?"
Well, you have to admit, I do challenge you a little bit there because
Yeah, you
I
do.
have like a whole bunch of different series, and you come up with a creative vision for each of those series.
Hmm.
That's actually so. That's what I want to talk about next. Because a lot of times indie authors will have different series, and in my case, of course, I've got a couple different fiction series, and then I've got a bunch of nonfiction series, and the nonfiction even has different genres in it. So when you're working with an author and you realize and you know it's not just like an individual cover but it's an actual series, what's your thought or your process around developing a cohesive series that as far as the image and the branding goes that kind of plays across all of the books?
The first thing you have to do is make sure the assets are available to cover the full series because there's nothing. We've had clients come to us before where they've had to switch cover designers mid-series because either they've been ghosted or they're just too busy or whatever. And we'll come into it and think to ourselves, oh, they've used this person on book one and book two, but there's literally no other image that uses this person available. So we can't continue their series with the same protagonist that they had initially. And that's just a bad way to start a series. The first thing you do is say, right, this is going to be a 6 book series. Here's this person. They're exactly as the author described them. They're perfect. How many poses am I going to have? Are they going to be available? Um, are they suddenly going to get pulled, which is an important thing as well, because believe it or not, stock libraries, they're not permanent. So you can add some things to your lightbox to use for future books. and then you go back to use them, and the artist, the photographer or the model has just disappeared off the library, and you're stuck. So in those cases, once the client, this is just in terms of the cover art itself, once the client says, "Yep, this is the right person, you've got the right idea for this," I will go ahead and I'll buy all of them straight away because I know that I'm going to use them all, and that means I'm completely covered. The next thing, the most important thing for me is the series branding, because if somebody sees your book 3 on a shelf and there's nothing there that ties it into books 1 and 2, they're not going to know that it's part of the same series. They're going to know that you've written it. They're going to know that it's got a nice cover and it's got a nice title, but they're not going to know that it's part of the same series unless they look closely and see the wording, like book 3 of whatever. You can't really do that. You have to have a brand that immediately jumps out so that somebody looking on the bookshelf says, "Oh, that must be part of this series because it has this branding to it." Like I've started work on a series. What's this? This is Wednesday, so it was Friday last week. The client said it's a 3 book series, and I want the same background image to be used on all 3 books. But I don't mean that each book has the same background image. I mean it's one single background image, but the books pan across. So book 1 will have one section of it, book 2 will have a separate section, and book 3 will have a separate section, and they'll all overlap. So part of book two's spine and front cover will be part of book one's front cover, that kind of thing. Um, so everything had to be created, even though it's going to be like 2022 before book 3 even gets looked at. I've already had to create the full panoramic landscape for all 3 books, and I'm having to design each cover on this one single landscape and
Mm.
switch elements off and on so that everything ties. It's seamless. If somebody takes out all 3 of the book covers and lies them next to each other, they will complete a full panoramic scene. You have to think in advance. It's like programming. When you're a computer programmer, you have to think about every possible eventuality that's going to happen. And because I was a programmer before I became a cover designer, that's what I do with series. I think, right, we're starting on book 1. That's all very well and good, but what happens if halfway through the series the author decides they want to write a spin-off book with somebody that you've featured on a book? Is there going to be the assets available to be able to use those ones as well? So you have to think in branches. It's unbelievable what you have to get your head around when you start on a series, even when with your non-fictions. Everything that I'm doing for you within your separate series, within your main category, I have to think, can this continue beyond? What happens if he gets to the end of the 5th book and decides, I'm not going to end here? I want a 6th book. We've not discussed it, but I want a 6th book. I have to say, that's fine. We can do that. So yeah, it's a very forward thinking process.
Well, this is good for me to hear
Yeah.
because I think as an author, I did like you have this idea of like how many books you think you're gonna have, and then you get surprised. Like in the case of the Zombie Apocalypse Call Center series,
Yes.
I've got like so far I've got 4 books. Well, and then I'm starting to work on an anthology which for that series, and then after that I've got one more book after that. I'm relatively sure that's it. So it's 6 books right
Uh-huh.
there, plus 2 novellas. And you just got the got the initial cover for the one novella to me, which looks awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
My wife loved it as well. She's like, that totally captures the attitude of the character, and I'm like, all right, awesome. But I just I think that a lot of people don't think to that extent, and I'll admit, like I'm hearing you say this and I'm like, oh, I really need to think about that the next time with my fiction series. I mean, I think like with my nonfic, particularly with the Walking with Spirit series, I said, it looks like it's going to be 5 books. It may end up actually being 6 books. So I mean, like you said, you just don't know. And it's kind of an interesting realization that you have as an author to hear this, for me to hear this on your end, and to see how you have to plan that out, because it reminds me too, like really as an author, I want to be planning those things out, but sometimes it's easy to lose that perspective because you're focused on the writing. And so hearing it from the other side, the person who's helping to create the cover art in this case, really gives me some perspective on, kind of the planning that I need to bring in to bring to your attention. And speaking of that, one of the things that occurs, of course, is that you ideally fill out a creative brief. Now, my creative briefs are fairly brief and concise, but what is it that you look for typically when an author contacts you? I know that you do definitely reach out and connect with them, but what are the things that you initially look for? What is it you'd like to see from them when they're first contacting you and giving you an initial brief about what they're looking for?
Um, there's nothing really specific. There's a form on the website that we ask everybody to fill in. Probably 80% of the clients do that. Some of them don't. Some of them just use the general inquiry form and say, I've got a book. I want to put it out next month. This is the title. This is my author name. Can you help me out? So then I've got to start the entire conversation and start asking them questions. Um, when they fill out the form, I know this is going to sound quite hypocritical. When they fill out the form, it doesn't really matter what they say on the form because I will always have questions. I never ever just take what they've said and thought, okay, I know what I'm doing. There's been times um, where I've had inspiration straight away, and I've immediately thought to myself, I know exactly what I want from this cover. So I'll go ahead and I'll create a draft. You know yourself, if I'm at the PC when the email comes in, I will reply straight away.
Hmm.
So, like in the case of Kelly Marie, she contacted me about, I think it was about 11 o'clock one morning. The inquiry came in. She said what it was that she wanted. It was an actual doorway into a different world. Um, the book was called Mystic Princess, and she said that the book featured elements, like fire, water, air, and all that. And that it was like in this sort of leafy glade. So before I replied to her, I had already created a draft, and I said to her, "No idea if you'll like this, but this is exactly what I got from what you've said." And when she saw the cover, she was blown away because there's a passage in her book where she actually describes the doorway, and she talks about the fact that the elements are carved into the doorway, and one of the elements is right above in the sort of like the ornate rose that's above the gateway. And I had done all this based on what she had told me, even though she hadn't specified this. So straight away, all we did was we made some changes to it. From the first conversation, I got exactly what she was looking for and nailed it the first time. It doesn't often happen, um, and it wasn't because of a really detailed brief. It was just things that I had gleaned from what she said that inspired me to create it. She didn't say, I want a doorway, it needs to be in a leafy glade, it needs to have elements on it. I want to have some sort of like fairy dust sparkling coming from it. I want it to have gold lettering. I need there to be some filigree around it. There was nothing like that at all. It was just I read what she had and there was enough there to get the inspiration. So even if the client gives me a, a brief that's 10 screens long on my mail software, or whether they give me 2 paragraphs, I will always still get inspiration straight away and pitch the idea to them or ask them questions if I don't get the inspiration straight away. Um, but yeah, it's important that the client knows themselves what their book is about. We did have somebody who was publishing literary fiction, and they said what they would like to see on the cover. They gave me 2 or 3 different choices, and I thought to myself, this doesn't really sound like literary fiction. The covers won't match. It's more not quite horror, but it was really quite disturbing the things they wanted on the covers. So I asked, well, I mean, yeah, I'm not getting into it, but it was disturbing. And I said to the chap, can I please have your manuscript? I know it's unorthodox. Can I have your manuscript? So he sent me the full manuscript. I read the first chapter, I read the last chapter, and I picked about 2 or 3 chapters from, like dotted cherry picked within it. And I thought to myself, yeah, he's got this all wrong. I don't know why he's going for this particular style, but it's wrong. So I said to the guy, this is what I think your book should be targeted like. And I pitched my idea to him, and he said, "Let's try it." I gave him the cover, and he said, "Yeah, perfect, nailed it." I don't know what would have happened if I had just taken his word and created the covers. I don't think he'd have had many sales. And I think the people who bought the book would have been quite, I don't know, not disappointed, but surprised at the content.
I think that, I think that's absolutely true, because if a cover doesn't match the content or the expectations of the readers, they're not going to buy. You
Yeah,
know, it's kind of like when you go onto a site, if you have the wrong categories associated with the books, it's the same kind of thing. You're not going to necessarily have the audience that you would expect to have there. And I think a lot of times people get wrapped up in their own notions or ideas as to what they expect the cover to look like, without necessarily checking in and saying, well, what is this really going to? And really, I mean, I speaking as an indie author, I mean, it's really a process of trust. Like when I come to you and I say, okay, here's my latest book, can you come up with a cover for this? And you say, yeah, sure, I can do that, I'm trusting you, and trusting your thing. And I mean, I think that, I mean, I certainly have my own ideas and input on what I think the cover ought to look like, and sometimes I'll be very specific about it, other times I won't, until I've actually seen the cover, because sometimes you also just need to be able to see it brought to life before you can really know it. But it's one of those cases where it really does make a significant difference. And of course, I mean, the one thing the author always has to keep in mind is they need to know their own market. But
hmm,
sometimes, sometimes they get caught up in the vision of what they think something is, without necessarily looking at the market. And at the same time, I mean, what I really like, as I said before, about your covers is that they are distinct. I mean, I know that, like, if you look at like my occult nonfiction, for example, that you've put covers to, it's all very distinct. It's its own separate thing. And that's what I like about it, because it's very easy for me to say, okay, here's a cover that really makes this book stand out, in a way that's different from what other people expect of it. And I think that's really absolutely essential. But a lot of times, um, authors do get caught up in that trap again of what we talked about, where they kind of, they have their own vision, but they haven't necessarily thought out the market. So it's good to know that you're asking questions. I mean, that's one of the things I've always liked about you. It's not just, oh yeah, I've just taken his instructions. It's, hey, I've got some ideas, or here's some questions. I mean, I think you've gotten to the point where I think, because you've gotten to know me well enough, you got a pretty good idea and you just run with it. But we still occasionally have some back and forth with ideas and things like that. And I like that, because it makes it very organic.
yeah. There's a couple of times where you could send me a brief one day, and I'll knock out a cover same day. You'll approve it. You'll get the full thing the next day, and then 2 or 3 days later, you'll send me the next brief, and I'll be like, I have got no idea what to do with this. I just got no clue. So, like the one that I had sent you that had the sort of like ethereal blue images,
Hmm.
and it had the sort of jaunty, friendly typeface. And you're like, no, 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 no. That's not what we're looking for at all. But that was me. I hit a wall. I hit this mental wall where I'm thinking, I've got no idea what I can do with this. And then I don't remember what it was you said, and I went, oh. Then that was it.
I think I had you look at some covers, but I also was like, no. But then I was also like, here's this thing about the audience you need to know, or whatever, or something to that effect. Yeah, but it worked out. And then, yeah, the two covers for that series so far have been excellent. And I mean, those books have been selling great. I'm like so thrilled.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I
I
mean,
think
that's
it's
always.
important though. You should always tell your cover designer that you don't like something. I've seen so many different authors post on various groups where they've said like, yeah, this is what my cover designer's given me. This was like the fourth or fifth draft. I didn't like the first two. We started to get there. It's just got to the point now where I'm thinking, ah, I'm just going to take it. You shouldn't do that. If you don't like it and you don't feel it's right for you, you shouldn't settle for it. Your cover designer is either going to say, okay, let's just keep on going, or they'll hold up their hands and say, "I really have got no idea what to do. Here's somebody else you might want to try if you're starting to lose patience with me." But your cover designer will rarely lose patience with you because it's a creative process. I suppose authors also understand that it's not just a case of programming where you have to have something happen, therefore, there's only two or three ways that you can actually achieve this. Cover design, you're starting off with a blank canvas. You have to try and encompass everything that the author is trying to convey in this one image, but you can't try and sell a scene either. That's another thing that authors try to do. They say there's this particular scene in my book where um, the fairy queen is riding in the back of a stag and she's galloping through the forest being chased by dragons, and there's arrows flying at her from left and right, and that's the thing that I want to have on the cover. And you have to explain to the author that's not how a book cover works. That's how a trailer would work, but not a book cover. Your book cover has to give everybody the idea of the entire book. Have your protagonist, maybe have them riding on the back of the stag, but don't show them the dragons fighting them. Don't show them being attacked by arrows. Take it, tone it back. Um, yeah, it's important to work with your designer. Don't accept everything straight away. If you're not happy with it, tell them you're not happy. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a cover that you're not going to be proud of, and no designer wants that for you.
Well, not only that, but I mean, as an author, I mean, I always I used to say this back in the days of traditional publishing. It was why I would always, at least with the small press that I was working with, I'd always push to get more input from the authors. I'd be like, look, if the author isn't proud of the cover, that book isn't going to sell because the author
Hmm.
has to go out there and sell that book. It's not I mean, sure, we're publishing it, and as an indie author, I think that's especially the case. You have to be willing to go out there and publish that book. You have to put yourself out there. And if you're not proud of the book cover or you're not proud of something else, if there's anything that you're not 100% behind, that's where you need to make some changes. Otherwise, you're not gonna put your best effort out there yourself. So I totally agree with that. And I'd also just say from a perspective of, okay, I'm dropping some money down on this cover. If I'm dropping some money down on the cover, I want to make sure the cover really represents what I'm going for, because at the end of the day, that's an investment that I've made in
Yeah,
my work and in the work of the person who's creating the cover. And it's got to be reflective. I mean, I knew, like as an example, that cover that you mentioned it was for the Walking with Magical Entities book. When I first got it, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, but I'm like, it doesn't fit the book.
yeah,
I'm like, no one's going to buy this because it looks too new agey. It's something that would be great for something else, but for my audience, they will not take it seriously. And I was like, all right. And this is and again, for folks who are watching this and listening, this is for somebody who has a built-in audience. Like, I knew my audience, even though I have a built-in audience of fans. I mean, some people would buy it, but not as many people would buy it. And
hmm
that's the thing I think a lot of authors have to realize too. Like, you have to have that grade A excellence with everything that you do with your book. It's got to be not necessarily perfect. I mean, there's no such thing as perfect, but it's got to be good enough that it really truly reflects who you are and it represents what you're going for, because otherwise it's not going to grab people in the same way, and it's not going to be reflective of your work.
yeah. There's another side to the coin as well, which is again is quite hypocritical. Is listen to your cover designer, because there will be times where an author wants something and they absolutely want this thing on the cover. Um, and if the cover designer says to you, "Look, here's two or three dozen other books in your genre. If you put this in your cover, it's really not going to work." You need to listen to that because they know what they're doing. There might be some cover designers that are lazy and think, "Yeah, I don't want to have to go to that effort, so I'm just going to try and get the author to, don't dial it down a little bit." But most cover designers wouldn't do that, I don't imagine. But they will tell you straight away, or I will tell you, I will absolutely tell you straight away, don't do this because you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. you're going to get yourself sidelined. People are going to just think your cover looks stupid, or if you've called your book something like "My Life as a Go-Go Dancer in Miami," and then you've got the colon, and then you've got like 4 lines of text as your subtitle, you might think it's necessary, but when your cover designer tells you you need to dial that down to 1 line or 2 lines at most, you have to listen to them. So it is important as well to stick to your guns, but also pay attention because they will try and give you professional advice. If they don't give you any advice whatsoever and they just take your money and do whatever you want them to do, they're the wrong kind of cover designer. There should always be input both ways.
I agree
Always.
with yeah, I agree with that. That's absolutely true because that's a great point. I mean, yes, you as an author have an idea as to what the cover should look like, but there is that aspect of something that you might not be seeing or recognizing. Or like and you said, the case of 4 lines of subtitle, which, hey, you can do that if you want in the actual subtitle description, but I always recommend keeping it concise anyway for that reason. But
Yeah.
I think it's really absolutely critically important. So that's a great point that you bring up there. And I think a lot of times people who are they have their own creative vision, but they also need to realize, like, when you're working with somebody else, there has to be a way to mix that in and find a happy medium. And that's one of the things that I like with you is that, like you said, you do bring up stuff. You're like, oh, hey, have you thought about this? Or you might not want to do that or whatever else. I don't know if you've really ever had to do that with me, but I think,
No.
yeah, I don't think you have. But uh, I mean, a large part of that for me is that, I mean, again, I mean, I've been doing this for so many years that I've learned a pretty good idea of what will sell or won't sell as far as cover art goes from my own experiences. I'm not a cover art designer. I don't want to be. I don't have the time for it. But it's knowing when to do that give and take and when to say, you know what, this is going to work versus this isn't going to work. And I mean, I have had a few cover art, which either for my books or other people's books back in the day that I didn't like. And in retrospect, part of it was I didn't know how to advocate as much for myself as I should have, but maybe also I didn't know what questions to ask or to say to the cover artist, hey, I want your honest feedback. What do you think of this? Do you think this is going to sell? So I think, as an author, you have to be willing to advocate for your creative vision, but you also have to be willing to listen. And part of advocating for your creative vision is actually getting the input from the cover artist.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's probably, I think it's something like 350 covers that I've designed now in the last 3 years. And only 5 or 6 I would never put my name to. Um, because it's only those ones where the client has just pushed back, and no matter what has been advised or recommended, they've said, no, you will do exactly what I want. So their covers, I mean, I have no idea how their books are selling, um, but they're not going to be selling.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings up an interesting point too, because sometimes you have clients. I would call them toxic clients, where like people have a very specific way of where they want things done a certain way or whatever else, and they're not willing to listen or whatever else. And so, I mean, that's a good example of where you may not necessarily have even found out because it's like, well, they never came back after that because of
Hmm.
that interaction, and that's too bad. But I mean, I think that that's where again you want to develop the right rapport with your creative studio. Now we've talked about cover art a lot, but you guys also do editing and you do layout. So let's talk a little bit about that. My understanding, now do you do the editing and layout as well, or who all does that in your creative studio?
Lorna takes care of all the formatting, everything that happens inside a book. She takes care of it, unless it's a children's book where it's an actual illustrated, where you've got like an illustrated panel on one face and then the text on the other, or if there's text on top of the illustrated image, I'll take care of that because that's graphic design. But the interior formatting and design, Lorna takes care of all of that. She's been doing that for roughly 3 years now after her own books were completely ruined by a professional formatter.
Hmm.
That's why she took that on herself. Um, she makes sure she never uses any templates. There's nothing that she downloads from anywhere, nothing that's available free online. She doesn't start anything at all until I've completed the cover design because the interior is designed specifically based on the cover.
Oh wow, that's
Um,
really cool.
yeah, the genre obviously plays a huge part in it. Um, but whenever it gets to the stage where the client signed off on the artwork, everything's been rebuilt to full size, full resolution with all the licensed assets. Um, that's when I send everything over to her, say, right, okay, here's your title graphics, this is the typefaces that are going to be used. And then she'll send the client over about a dozen different samples of how it's going to look inside. She'll play with different chapter headings and scene breaks. Um, and then she'll send them over to the client, and they'll either pick one specifically, or they'll say, I want this from this sample, this bit from this sample. And then she'll go ahead and do that. All of the editing is done by me. I was a magazine editor for a number of years back in 1990 to 1993, and then I was editor in chief of an online magazine from 2009 to 2016. But editing isn't something that I really ever wanted to get back into doing because I didn't actually enjoy it um, because it was journalistic. But we had a client whose editor vanished. They had taken their full payment, not even a deposit, but their full payment,
Oof.
and disappeared, ghosting them completely. Still active in social media. We contacted them ourselves and says we can't move any further forward because we need the manuscript. Person didn't respond to us either. We took it up with PayPal on behalf of the client. We managed to get the money back for them, which was fantastic. It was after 60 days as well. So PayPal paid them back about 4 months into the whole deal. Um, and I said to her, I'll edit your manuscript for you free of charge because she had a pre order date on Amazon. And if you don't make that pre order date, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So I sat down and I went through the manuscript for her, and she was blown away by it. One of the things as well was she said, "Would you mind looking at my first book? Now that you've done the second book, would that be okay?" So I said, "Okay." And I looked at the first book, and on the first page, the protagonist, no, sorry, the antagonist had the wrong hair color. Um, but her first editor hadn't even noticed that. So the way I work is I create character sheets as I'm going. There's a whole spreadsheet in Excel. Every single character is added to it as soon as I encounter them within the manuscript. And every other person who turns up, I take a note of their relationship to the other people, their description, their mannerisms, certain things they will say, the kind of personality they have, um, locations, currencies, all that sort of thing, so that by the time it gets to the second pass of the book, I can then cross reference and make sure that everything is exactly as it should be. Yeah, but I love editing now. I hated it when it was journalistic, but after doing Kelly's book, and reading through it, I thought this is. I would never have read that book if I hadn't been editing it. And then another client said, "Do you happen to know an editor?" And I said, "Right, okay, I'll do this for you. This is how much it's going to cost, based on how long it will take me." And I loved doing that book as well. And after that, I thought to myself, we're going to have to offer this as a service because I'm getting to read some fantastic books. And yeah, I've loved it ever since. It's quite a thrill. Um, I've from thriller to erotica to non-fiction. Yeah, it's children's books, everything. It's a lot of fun. And the
Y-
important thing with editing as well is you never ever lose the client's voice ever.
Right.
Um, so so even like the Chicago Manual of Style will say this has to be done in a certain way. But if the person's, I mean, there are probably 95% of editors out there that will just blindly follow the Chicago Manual of Style no matter what. And I think it's great to a certain extent, but if it doesn't fit the author's voice, you absolutely should not do it. You still have to take into consideration the integrity of the voice of the author. So yeah, I'm probably disliked by a number of editors because of that.
Well, hey, that's okay. It's better to maintain a quality of work. I mean, that's I mean, I say that because I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. And a lot of times I think authors, you don't want to compromise. So finding the right services can make a huge difference. And that's one of the things that you guys offer. I mean, I think it's really impressive. And I know I've only worked with you guys in relationship to cover art, but I mean, just based off of that alone, I would still recommend you for the editing and the other stuff. I remember I did send you one manuscript one time, and it hadn't been edited yet. And you're like, "Oh, hey, do you need editing?" And I appreciated the fact that you noticed that. I just hadn't had a chance for my editor to look at it. So then I was like, but it stood out to me a lot, and it made me appreciative of you on that level. So I mean, I think that it's one of those things where, again, having the right creative suite, the right creative services can make a huge difference. And so for those of you out there who are listening, obviously I'm biased. I do work with Mark quite a bit, but I heartily recommend author packages. And one of the reasons why I brought you on the show was because this is the second show for this particular thing, is because I wanted to partially draw attention to your awesome and amazing services, but also get a chance to interview you and actually get to talk to you.
Finally.
I know, I think that's cool. It's like we've emailed back and forth, but we've never actually talked. So it was making me happy for that. So any final words or thoughts you want to share with our audience here?
Not really. Just, I think, as somebody who's been a creative all my life, whether it's been as an artist or a musician or whatever, the thing that I would say to every author is to just never lose sight of what it is that you want. It's not going to be easy. We've had people come to us who have planned on doing 2 or 3 books. They've put out their first book. They've had that sort of mentality of build it and they will come. So the book's been out on Amazon. They've not had a great take up on it, but they've also not done any marketing themselves. They haven't even like said to their friends on Facebook, you know, pick up the book, give me a review, that kind of thing. Nothing. So book 2 never happened. Book 3 never happened. And if I had given up when nobody was coming to our gigs when I played in the band, I wouldn't still be a musician today. But the important thing is, if you're a creative, if you truly are a creative, and it's something that burns inside you, that where you just have to write because you feel better for it, it's an emotional outlet. It helps you psychologically, or you just literally just want people to find out what's going on inside your head. Then it doesn't matter if your first book doesn't sell, because by the time your second book comes out, you can then give away your first book for free. Your second book will gain momentum. You'll start to get the following, and it does take time. I mean, our first year in business, I think we made about 20% of what we've made this year, and this year hasn't even finished. So,
Yeah.
being an author is a business. You have to think of it as being a, a startup business. And if it's your first book, think of it as your first year in business. It's going to be 2 or 3 years before you finally start to see a return, and don't lose hope.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, I say that, because on the fiction side of things, like I said, I started a couple years ago with the fiction as well. Actually, I started really last year, I would say 2019. And like now I'm starting to see more of an audience. Some of that's because of some stuff I've been trying. Like I did a huge promo special type thing for the Zombie Apocalypse series this last week. I could have timed it better. I mean, that's its own little thing there for me, but and I'll be talking about that in a later episode. But it still was really cool to see copies flying off the shelves there, so to speak. But it takes time. You have to build that audience up, and you got to be willing to put yourself out there. And being an author is a business. I mean, I say that as somebody who went I always said that even as a traditional publisher, like, look, it's a business. Like you have to be willing to put yourself out there. But when you're an indie author, it's especially a business because at that point you are in control of everything to some degree or another. And you know, it's a wonderful business, but you got to put yourself out there for sure. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're definitely going to have you back again in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to snag Lorna for the next time as well.
Yeah,
And because that would be awesome, I'd love to meet her as well, and also talk more about the layout aspects of stuff. But again, just really happy to have you on here, and thank you so much for coming on.
no problem. Thanks again. Take care.
You too.